If you're like me, you probably look at fat mats and think, that sure looks nice, but it's kind of pricey. Well, here's the good news. It's really not that hard to make one yourself. All you need is a really huge mouse pad and some dye. Conde Systems sells mouse pad material in bulk. I went with the thinner 1/8 inch material as it's easier to take on the go. It's a little bit lighter and it actually more closely matches the traditional fat mat. They sell it by the yard, so if you are a 40K player, you'll want 2 yards to get a 5 foot by 6 foot sheet. It comes as 5 foot wide. And if you are more of a War Machine player, well, unfortunately you'll still need to get 2 yards to make a 4x4 sheet, since 1 yard is only 3 feet. Now, if you have some friends that play with you, you could probably talk a couple of them into going into it with you, and you could just get 4 yards, and you could make 3 mats out of that. When I ordered, they also called to check with me to make sure details of the order, if I wanted it cut up by the yard or if I wanted it all in one sheet. So just in case, you might want to include a note when you do the order letting them know that you do want it all as one sheet. They're pretty cool, pretty understanding about that sort of thing. You may even be able to talk them into cutting it up to the right sizes for you. I didn't actually try that, but maybe you can. The next thing that we'll need is some dye. I used Jacquard's Dynaflow. Works really well on polyester materials like our mouse pad. It mostly comes in smaller jars though. It took me about 4 of those to fully cover the mat. You'll also need some Airfix, also from Jacquard, that allows the dye to air dry rather than needing a heat press. You'll want some kind of foam brush to apply it. Those are super cheap. You can get them in Walmart, any local store like that. And finally, if you want to be able to draw on deployment zones, you're going to want some kind of fabric marker. I just use a thin black fabric marker. Those are also fairly cheap. So here's the bad news though. Once you add all that stuff up, you're still looking at spending $7 or maybe a little bit more depending on where you order from. So now you're kind of starting to see that maybe fat mats aren't such a bad deal after all. Especially since what we're doing here is basically just getting a generic color. We're not really going to be able to get the cool patterns that they get on the real fat mats. So it's kind of pluses and minuses, but if you're still interested in seeing how this works, keep watching. So step 1 here is going to be to cut the mat. Since it comes 5 feet wide, we're going to need to cut it down to 4 feet for most of our mats, unless you just want a big 5 foot wide mat. It does have a little bit of overhang from the fabric on both sides though, so you'll at least want to cut that off the sides. I just cut it off one side, then measured 4 feet from that side and just cut along the mat on the other side. If you're doing a smaller mat for War Machine, obviously you'll also need to cut 4 feet the other way. And that's basically it as far as mouse pad prep goes. The next thing is to mix our dye. Here I am actually mixing a red dye that I used later, but when I actually did this, I used all 4 jars of brown and then a couple drops of the Airfix, probably 3 or 4 drops. You actually don't really need any more than that. It's a very small amount of Airfix that you need. So then shake it up, make sure everything is well mixed. You're also gonna want some kind of pot of water to mix with the dye to dilute it. As far as the dilution goes, kind of messed around with that a little bit as I went. I just had the dye and the water in separate jars, and as you can kind of see as I'm going along here, I kind of made it up as I went along. It's not super important, and in fact it's probably not even desirable to have a really consistent color going along the mat. It looks a little bit more like windswept terrain or a little bit more realistic in general if it's not all one solid color. So just kind of play with it. I think what I ended up doing was just dunking the brush in the dye and then dunking it in the water and then just spreading it around on the mat, and that gave me a pretty good amount to work with, and then I just went from there. While you're doing this, you are probably going to want some newspaper or other throwaway material under the mat as the dye tends to soak through. Once you are done with the dyeing process, you're just going to want to let it sit overnight. Ideally, you would be able to just leave it sit out flat overnight. If you have a cat like me, that may not be realistic. Unfortunately, in my case, because I was not able to do that, I ended up with this crack-looking thing down the center where the dye pooled up. And I ended up trying to fix that by making it look like a river of lava, but mostly just made it look worse. So the lesson learned here is if you can leave it sit flat, please do. And the last step, and this is optional, is to draw out your deployment zones. So once your die is dry, just lay out your mat, measure along where your deployment zones would end, take your fabric marker and just draw some lines. I just use dotted lines so that they would be a little less intrusive, I guess is the word, going along there. And that's pretty much it. Like I said, it's really easy to make. It's not super labor intensive. It takes a little bit of time, but as I said, you know, you're only saving probably 10-20 bucks, so is it worth it? I don't know, that's up to you. It is kind of cool, a conversation starter if you bring it to the table and you got your friends or some other people you're playing with, you can say, hey, look what I made. So there it is. Enjoy your homemade fat mat.